And I'm going to begin by welcoming our audience. As you flow into our virtual room, welcome to the second of our public seminar book talks. Before we get started, I just want to tell you a couple things about this series and about Public Seminar. Public Seminar is an online web magazine that is housed at the New School. I will put the link to it in the bio. The link was also in the email that you received. And Public Seminar is a web magazine of culture and ideas. And in the past couple of years, one of the things we have been doing a lot of is featuring books. There are so many wonderful books written. They do not get the attention they deserve. They often get tiny little 700-word reviews in academic journals that come out 3 years after the book was written. And so one of the really great opportunities for Public Seminar has been to get terrific books like Debjani's out to the audience closer to the time that they were actually written. So these book talks, I would like to say, are very much a product of the pandemic. But there's been such an enthusiastic response to them that they may be a permanent feature of Public Seminar's offerings beyond the pandemic. So I will send you an email after it's over, giving you the opportunity to subscribe to our newsletter so that you can be among the first to know about the book talks. But we do have several coming up. On July 1st, we will be hosting Ariela Gross and Alejandro de la Fuente, who will be discussing their co-authored book, Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and the Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana, that is just out in 2020. Also down the line, we have Eric Alterman, a journalist and historian at Brooklyn College and CUNY Grad Center. And we will also have Rick Perlstein, who has the fourth volume of his series on American politics coming out in August, which is called Reaganland. But we're going to have many other offerings in between, so I will keep you posted and give you an opportunity to find out those things. So I'd like to begin by introducing the author, Debjani Bhattacharyya. Bhattacharyya. Sorry, exactly. Debjani, I'm such a jerk, such a jerk. She is an assistant professor of history. I assume still an assistant?
I became associate.
Yay! All right, as well you should have on the back of that wonderful book. An associate professor of history at Drexel University who needs to update their website. Debjani's research addresses two broad questions: how environment and ecological formations shaped law and economy from the 18th century onward, and how the contingencies through which legal and economic imaginaries developed and globalized across the world in turn reshaped colonial environments. In particular, she's interested in tracing how the specific geography of the colony, its rivers, seas, swamps, deltas, and seasons, which were different from the temperate climate of Europe, shaped the legal and economic technologies during the period of European expansion and came to occupy the position of universal knowledge and science. She explores these themes from a South Asian perspective, and especially by focusing on the Bay of Bengal Delta, one of the active deltas connecting India and Bangladesh. So her book, Empire and Ecology in the Bengal Delta, The Making of Calcutta, is published in 2018, is part of the Studies in Environment and History series at Cambridge University Press. It is her first book, and she's now working on a second project, which I'm so excited about, which is about monsoons. And maybe at the end, Debjani, you'll tell us a little bit about that second book, or maybe find some ways to get your new research into this discussion. As a commentator and interlocutor today, we have Kasia Paprocki, an assistant professor in, are you still an assistant professor too, Kasia? Yeah. Okay, in the Department of Geography and Environment at the London School of Economics. Kasia's work addresses issues within and between the study of political economy of development, political ecology, social movements, and agrarian change. Kasia's research is regionally focused on South Asia, particularly Bangladesh. Her current book project, based on over 2 years of ethnographic and archival research in South Asia and Europe, examines the political ecology of climate change adaptation in coastal Bangladesh. And I have to say, we've all been talking about the pandemic nonstop, but I can't think of two scholars whose work is more relevant to this moment. And obviously I owe the entire world an apology for the United States' failure to actually grapple with climate change, and we're hoping we can change that in November. So how we will proceed is, I believe we decided that Kasia, you would begin by raising some themes about Debjani's work. Debjani will then come in and talk about the book, highlighting some of its themes, responding to Kasia's questions. Debjani has also promised us to read a few of the opening paragraphs of the book, which captured my imagination. I'm an American historian. I know very little about the history of India, although I've always been interested in it. And Debjani simply captured me in those first few paragraphs. They're so beautifully written, and a real invitation to buy this book. And there's a link in the chat where you can go and buy the book if it pleases you to do so. So I'm going to turn this over to Kasia and Debjani. Kasia, you're on.
Well, Debjani, do you want to start us off by reading the first couple paragraphs of the book just to get us going, and then I'll...
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you so much to Claire for doing this, and thank you to Kasia for taking the time out of a busy semester. It is an incredibly busy time for everybody, and thank you to all the audiences. So I'll do something I've never done. I'm a terrible reader. That's why I never became a news reporter, but I will read from my book. Okay, so this is the beginning. This is a history of forgetting in the Bengal Delta, a forgetting that enabled human design in the world's largest delta and one of its most vulnerable landscapes. From the 18th century on, colonial law, bureaucracy, and technology eclipsed and erased the secrets of landmaking and unmaking in Bengal's seaface, where land dissolved gradually into the vast and turbid waters of the Bay of Bengal, in order to build colonial Calcutta, the second capital of British India. In the post-colonial moment, this amnesia has turned into hubris, where the aqueous and the igneous elements are now being transformed into landed concrete property. Such is the aspiration of Atmosphere, one of the new high-rises under construction in the world's fourth most low-lying city in Kolkata, Calcutta as its current name. By the way, Atmosphere is right next to Calcutta's only Trump Tower, I must point out, also built on the wetlands. Billed in its promotional literature as your home in the clouds, Atmosphere is selling the promise of a glistening new apartment building projecting into the sky in eastern Kolkata. The architects of Atmosphere claim that it is the first residential sky sculpture in the world. Architectural design, along with India's emerging aspiration to be part of a global informational economy, manifest themselves as homogeneous and smooth spaces of new satellite towns, flanking Indian metropolises, often erasing their fluid ecologies. In eastern Kolkata, skyscrapers sprout up with unimaginable speed, tiling the landscape with uninhabited speculative properties, often owned by wealthy absentee landlords. The ambition to reach for the clouds of this ethereal atmosphere is not ironic, given that many owners are simply buying up air in hope of future profits. Yet this shining built landscape of glass, steel, concrete, and the air waiting to turn solid is also hiding a secret beneath it. These seemingly solid structures are standing on liquid land. Even 30 years ago, much of this terrain was wetlands and served as home to fishermen and farmers. 19th century colonial officials, but today's commuters, travelers, inhabitants are never far from the smell of the salty bogs that flank the delta city of Calcutta. Yet the citizens and the city's planners too often forget the delta and its salt marshes. The Hooghly River flanks Calcutta's western bank, and the city merges into vast bodies of lakes, wetlands, and floodplains to its east. Calcutta is situated in a combined river system comprised of the Ganga, Brahmaputra, and Meghna rivers, creating the world's largest delta. Each year, these rivers carry about 40 billion cubic feet of silt on their journey to the Bay of Bengal. Moreover, Calcutta is also on the edge of the world's largest mangrove estuary and rimmed by critical wetlands of eastern India. Beginning in the 17th century, the Hooghly River appears in history as a central highway of the British Empire, when Calcutta was its emporium and the capital through which commodities such as saltpeter, opium, salt, silk, cotton, jute, rice, tea moved from the east to the west. Furthermore, countless migrant laborers followed these goods in their oceanic circuits, making Calcutta a contact zone for the circulation of ideas, resources, and knowledge. Beyond this commercial history, the river, its water, silt, and tides have shaped the city and its land market in both implicit and explicit ways. That is the nature of deltaic cities. Empire and Ecology conceives of the built environment of Calcutta as a sedimentation of historical time, silt, and human design in order to write the river and the deltaic ecology into the city's history. Thank you.
Thank you, Debjani. And for those of you who are just joining us now, this is Debjani Bhattacharyya, and she is reading from her book, which is Empire and Ecology in the Bengal Delta. And just to let all of you know, you can start asking questions anytime you want using the Q&A function in the bottom bar. So Kasia, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so just thanks again, Claire, so much in Public Books for organizing this conversation, and Debjani for the opportunity to engage with this really brilliant and provocative book. I think it's so important, and it helps us to understand not only the sort of colonial geography of the making of Calcutta itself, but also more broadly to understand bigger questions about how land is made and how land is rendered investable and how legal systems sort of reshape these kinds of fluid ecologies. So I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. And you know, as Claire said, my own work is about the political ecology of climate change and adaptation in the Bengal Delta. And so I am particularly sort of moved and excited about the way that Debjani renders this really incredibly unique landscape of the Bengal Delta. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's the youngest and most active delta in the entire world, which means that the rivers are constantly shifting and the land itself is often quite mutable. And Debjani in the book uses this really beautiful and evocative language to describe this mutability of the landscape. So where colonial administrators often refer to the landscape simply as a swamp, Debjani instead describes what she calls a fluid ecology, a mobile landscape, and she discusses this ecological indeterminacy, which is always in a state of flux between aqueous and igneous, sometimes referring to what she calls a land-water admixture, and at one point she calls it liquid land. So it's really beautiful and a pleasure to read about this. And this is how she sort of gives us this really evocative picture of what it is that makes this landscape anything but fixed. So in this sense, the book is quite geographically and historically specific in the sense that she's examining colonial efforts to tame and transform this particular fluid ecology. But I think that she also in the book makes a really significant contribution far beyond a study of this unique landscape toward helping us to understand how property itself is made. And throughout the book, she examines what she calls technologies of fixing that attempt to control the mobility of the landscape. So in discussing technologies of fixing, she refers specifically to a distinction between what she calls technologies of engineering and technologies of property. So while much has already been written about engineering technologies of fixing, as she notes, and particularly in the colonial period, we see this, for example, about the filling in of Bombay. A lot has been written about technologies of engineering in the sort of fluid landscape of Bombay. Her contribution here is really unique in the sense that it helps us to understand legal technologies of property, how they serve to fix landscapes both materially and epistemically, and how this work facilitates dispossession. So to that end, she writes, unlike dams and multi-purpose river projects, the creation of a propertied geography did not take place in a grand technocratic manner, but was instead a slow process of accretion, erosions, and sedimentations, bolstered by a set of legal denominations and technological fortifications, such as roads, harbors, riverbanks, and a drained landscape. So, Debjani, this is where I'm gonna ask you a question. In this way that you've explored both these sort of material and epistemic technologies of fixing, you've demonstrated a kind of paradox about colonial administrators, how they needed to fix land in order to turn it into a resource, but at the same time, the fluidity of the landscape itself created opportunities for dispossession and accumulation. And so I wonder if you might reflect on this, this paradox for us, this sort of dual threat and opportunity of the mobility of the Bengal Delta.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for that excellent question. So a couple of things. Let me step back and begin. I was struck, and I think this is where I feel my work and Kasia's work complement, in the sense she says, like, she wants to focus on agrarian world and the agrarian futures that are being obliterated by our urbanizing or planetary urbanizing ways that we imagine, and she uses climate to think through that. And that's the provocation, and that's the kind of a conundrum of why anthropologists often turn to the urban and property and speculation to write about it. Whereas when we look at the agrarian studies, overwhelmingly historians had looked at property, and peasant and agrarian property is such a central concept in South Asian studies. Whereas when it came to the urban, it became an anthropological question of housing, land, political movements in the city. And so for me, the question was, what happens to the historical question of property in the urban? And that's where I began. And I had a very narrow project when I began my dissertation. I wanted to go and write about the long history of urban property and dispossession in Calcutta, or making of the urban land market, because I wanted to see if Bengal has been so productive in the history of property, especially the intellectual history of colonial property, and some of the central texts and ideas came out of studying the Bengal presidency, from customs to contract, intellectual history of property. And here I'm thinking of from Ranajit Guho's book, Rule of Property, to Andrew Sartori's book, Liberalism in Empire. I was asking what happened to the question of the urban property, what happened to the center where all of the Calcutta, where the entire circuit of financial capital was actually maneuvering the rural landscape. So I went and I would order these files about property disputes, and all the time I would get back these files about disputes about drains, spill channels, little ponds, little doba. Doba basically is like a depression that becomes a filled pond and seasonal pond in monsoon. And I would keep putting them away, trying to look for really like these like valiant tenants fighting back, or like migrants who are squatting. And then I step out, and we always go, as I told you, we always go as a graduate student in summer to do research. I step out of the archive and I'm knee deep in water. And I am thinking Calcutta's history has been written as a history of overcoming marshes. And some of the central books are from marsh to metropolis, as if the marshes have disappeared. And I'm like, wait a sec, Calcutta has actually not really been drained. So what exactly, or even if it has been drained, it has been a complete failure. So what exactly is the story here? And this brings me to your question, Kasia. Is this a story of a man versus nature, where I can say, oh, look, British Empire wasn't really that powerful? We've told that story. Look, East India Company failed in many projects. But in spite of that, the onward march of capital of the British Empire did not stop in 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1857 either. So the empire kept expanding. So how do I understand this? And that's when I understood that it's within the stories of these failures, there's a new story that is written, which we have to pay attention to. And as I started reading the first, the story I begin with, it's a story about this late 18th century merchant come speculator who was trying to build a harbor, and the harbor disappears into the Bengal Delta. It's a really minor, it's a story of a minor failure of this very ambitious and slightly delusional British character, but it tells us a lot, because it shows us how, while the making of property in the Delta was such a fraught process, what we see is also the ambiguity of the landscape was also legally very generative. So instead of telling the story of technological success in draining landscape, which we have told about New Orleans and also show its failure, or about a city like even Philadelphia, which was also established in marsh, or Bombay, which was often told as a story of success, although we are rethinking the story of that success of draining and creating Bombay, I realized that if we turn to the legal, we actually get a different kind of story. And this is a story where we see how the anomalies of the Bengal Delta actually resulted in creation of various kinds of emergency provisions within law, which then naturally made the company, East India Company, as the owner of these swamps, these undemarcated spaces. As soon as you call these swamps land, which could be land at a certain period and water at a certain period, it could be land in the morning during low tide and water. And you've been in the Sundarbans, you know, it's not just a seasonal thing, it can be a diurnal thing. So depending on when you do your cadastral survey or measurement, you actually get to call it land. And once you call something land, you set an entire set of economic and legal and bureaucratic processes. So it then became very productive for me to then take these tiny marshes, not like grand projects, and see how it goes from a lawyer's desk to an engineer's desk to a developer's snare, and really trace these kinds of stories to see how these small acts actually help us see a larger consolidation of power as property, as a speculative entity that we have completely naturalized in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I just want to jump in for a second to say to those who have just joined us and to the audience that has been here all along, we are taking questions in the Q&A box. You can open that up in the bottom bar of this screen, and we can just accumulate questions and then get to them in the last 20, 25 minutes of what we're doing here. So turning it back to you, Kasia.
Great, thanks. So yeah, thank you for that really sort of brilliant reflection, Debjani. And I think actually what you've just said really sort of feeds into the next question I had for you, which is that, you know, one of the things that I think is most fascinating about the way you describe these sort of different kinds of technologies of fixing is that they don't necessarily map onto each other. Right? So the material condition of the land, whether it is fixed or mobile, is often sort of inconsequential to the legal systems that seek to govern it. But also importantly, a piece of land can be legally fixed as property, but this sort of epistemic move doesn't mean that it will be fixed materially necessarily. So it might erode and dissolve just as soon as it is legally fixed, and it might be in a state of erosion even as it's being legally fixed. So I think you're making a really important contribution here to recent debates that have sort of followed this discussion about global land grabbing, about technologies through which land is rendered investable and becomes a resource. And on this topic, Tanya Lee a few years ago wrote a paper called "What is Land?", in which she wrote that she wrote of land that its materiality, the form of the resource, matters. Land is not like a mat. You cannot roll it up and take it away. It has presence and location. It has an especially rich and diverse array of affordances, uses, and values it affords to us, including the capacity to sustain human life. And so my question then for you, Debjani, is sort of reflecting on this, on what Tanya Lee is telling us about land. Do you think that the fluid ecology of Bengal should make us think about land differently, to answer differently this question, what is land?
Yep.
And sort of additionally, I wonder if the technologies of property used in the Bengal Delta have transformed what land there is, or only the nature of how it has been used as a resource, or potentially both.
Oh, that's very useful. So that really goes back to one of the things I was thinking through as I was writing the book is, what is it about land or swamps, if we just take it in that manner, what is it about land or swamps that we necessarily only can think of it as property? what about the propertylessness that actually uses land? And here I drew a little bit from the work by Sudipto Sen, Empire of Free Trade, where he really tries to think about the various proprietorial gestures that cannot be legally validated, that probably doesn't have any legal standing, but has a kind of a claim. And those kinds of claims were always lie at the excess of the property document, always are beyond the little document or the lease that give you. And as I started doing this work, I realized like much of Calcutta in the 1700s didn't have paper. So the making of paper as that between the human and the land that stands, that actually links them. And there are various sets of paper. There is the property document, there's the cadastre mapping that began in 1797 in Calcutta. Then there are ward mappings, various kinds of mapping. Actually, the paper regime, and Matthew Hall, Bhavani Raman, all their work has shown how this paper regime mediates, at the same time fails to mediate land relations in South Asia. And this, and it is, and Tanya Lee also has this interesting way, what I read her affordances, which also Elizabeth Povinelli, when she's looking at Aboriginal land relations in Australia, talks about this geo-ontological kind of claims through sweat and labor one makes to land in the absence of paper or the titling. These are very critical ways of thinking about it. So I'll just give you a small archival example of what I saw was very fascinating. One is when these marshes came up along the western side of Calcutta, which is which if anybody's been to Calcutta would know as the Strand Bank. There was actually no land. There was river till 1803-4, and then the river starts shifting and it deposits a long stretch of land. And many families who had riverfront properties made claims to those lands. And of course, the East India Company very busily went about claiming that as their land because it's newly formed land, and they use this category of fordability in water to say if the land is fordable, it becomes the land of the person who lives on the riverfront there. If it's not fordable, it becomes company land. So these are, quasi eminent domain practices that the marshes allowed to make these kinds of claims. And interestingly, it took over most of the lands. But what I found very interesting was this property owner, Anandamoyi Dashi. It's a single woman, a widowed property owner. She actually makes the claim back after the company takes over her land. She actually, and doesn't get compensation. She uses what she calls, and this is the process of erosion and accretion. She says there's a moving wall of mud every monsoon on my property. Wow. That's coming from the new land that's coming. And who is in charge of the moving wall of land? Because you have taken over my land. So if you are in charge of moving wall of mud, then you have to start paying me to remove that moving wall of mud. So it's this constant process of unmaking, which not only afforded the company claims to this land, but also became spaces to resist the company's claim to such land. So that's one way of looking at how this unfixing always, it's not the informal economy, but unfixing always exceeded the bounds of the property document, which became both a site of extraction and a site of resistance. And I think that kind of was, for me, very important to document. But then also there are other kinds of work. And here I'm thinking, and I've learned a lot from my colleagues who work in Chennai, especially Aditya Ramesh, Karen Coelho and Bhavani Raman. And they're doing very interesting work on the Aries. Aries are the seasonal kind of depressions which used to collect water and has been papered over now, built over by various kinds of housing projects. And they are really looking at the kind of new restoration that's beginning, where water has to be protected. And this began after the 2015 Chennai floods. Water has to be protected. And you see the same thing happening in the East Calcutta wetlands, where the wetlands are now have to be protected, where any kinds of claims of propertyless users of land gets completely erased, because conservation projects, ecological conservation projects, and the urban middle class of India wants to see landscape as only a property geography. And for me, that's important. Why did we equate land as the only way to understand land as a property geography? And what are we doing to the propertyless claims to land? And I don't want to call them encroachers, squatters, or any of these things. And I think propertylessness also has claims to land. And how do we actually articulate those claims? How do we let them occupy space within? How do we make those claims visible within the way we have conceived our landscape? I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, it has. Thank you.
So interesting. I feel like water is almost a character in the book. And just to interrupt for a second, for everybody who has joined us, we have one question in the Q&A that we're going to hold until Kasia has finished her questions. But please feel free to line up your questions. We will get to them as soon as Kasia and Debjani have finished their conversation.
Thanks, Claire. Okay, so one of the other things that I wanted to ask you about, and this is a little bit different from what we've been talking about so far, is about representations of this landscape and why they matter for the process of rendering the landscape sort of materially. And I mean, I think that one of the more evocative parts of the work is the way that you describe this kind of spectacular nature of colonial representations of the landscape that laid the foundation for these technologies of property. And these colonial dynamics are, of course, sort of familiar to historians of colonial Bengal, right? And in some ways, the way that you described this reminded me of Anna Singh's discussion of what she calls an economy of appearances that's necessary to creating an economic frontier for investment in land, right? So for example, you write about the development of this sort of repertoire of paintings of Calcutta's Maidan that render it aesthetically similar to the English countryside, which I thought was just brilliant. And what I wanted to ask you about specifically here is the urban specificity of these aesthetic representations and how they not only fixed the land in a way that transformed the ecology, in the case of the Maidan, by draining it, but also how they rendered a new understanding of urban space that was central in shaping Calcutta beyond the housing market. And part of the reason I'm asking you this is because in my own research, I've found that colonial administrators really regarded the Sundarbans in particular as uniquely wild, remote, and even dystopic, infested with tigers and other beasts. Rudyard Kipling called it unwholesome, the Sundarbans. And in some ways, this resonates with your own discussion of the understanding of the miasma of Calcutta's swamps, right? You're right that Calcutta became the quintessential place of sickness and death, with the swamps regarded as the culprit. But at some point, it seems to me that this economy of appearances shifted, and this particularly I see sort of in the third section of the book, where you're talking about creating a new sort of urban housing market in Calcutta in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. And so, you know, the spectacle of what Calcutta was and the sort of wildness had to start being erased in order to make Calcutta a space that was desirable for investment and habitation, real estate investment. You know, and the Maidan became this kind of bucolic English garden, right? And to me, it seems that this is necessary for rendering this distinction that you referred to before between the agrarian and the urban in Bengal, right? And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how this economy of appearances evolved, and how it shaped these distinctions between the rural and the urban in Bengal.
Oh, that's a very difficult question, but let me try my best to answer. And it's a very good question for you. You're pushing me to think about, in the representational state, what's specifically urban about this, or if it's just a Bengal landscape, if I hear you correctly. So let me begin by two things. Like when this was being written behind the major political event, like not a major, but a big kind of conservation ecological movement that was a very particularly urban movement that was happening in Kolkata at the time. The Maidan is this 333 acres of green space in the middle of the city. It's considered the lungs of the city, and a kind of a middle class environmental movement began and it was also the fairground where all the urban fairs were happening throughout winter. This was also a period when fairs were, through environmental movement, was shifted out of the city to the wetlands where they had constructed a former wetlands where they had constructed a pavilion ground. which also began the process of dispossessing the homeless population who were living in the Maidan at that time. Like, and there's a huge class and huge cluster of people that live around the Maidan and in the Maidan, and they actually live by cleaning the city, and their major part of their income came out of cleaning in the post fair moment in this time. So there was that was one story that remained in my head as I was writing. I was like, what is it about that? Why is it that within the urban, these green spaces become a question of value vis-a-vis, and you have to generate value vis-a-vis waste, which is the wetlands. But at the same time, as I was writing, we know that the question of value has also shifted. We cannot just say it's the green urban lungs are the value, because the wetlands are also the place where the new towns is being constructed. These are like this info, and you have explored how it's a geography of both migrant laborers, climate refugees from Bangladesh, but also the kind of built on remittance economy of people living in the West buying up property that they can go back or whenever they want, and it's also speculative market that is emerging. So it made me realize this is not an easy story of green space being lungs, and I needed to historicize this particular story. And what I realized is the fact that we've always looked at water that doesn't flow as a threat, because land should remain stable and water should always flow in our imagination. When water refuses to flow, we get worried, and when land starts flowing, we get worried. These are the threats that emerge, right? So what I realized is, like, so the swarms were being overwhelmingly written in municipal reports, these medico-municipal reports, sanitary committee reports, fever hospital reports, medical topographies at swarms that needed to be drained. But draining takes a lot of money, and municipal budgets are always in deficit. So what is happening is a political economy emerges around swarms that we see in the 20th century, where swarms became real estate in waiting. So a good land developer, as it emerges in the early 20th century rental debates, is one who actually drains a swarm to build it. And that doesn't map onto always the representational economy, right? So what you realize is, like, there are two kinds of representational economy at work in my work. So I do look at a lot of folkloric paintings, which kind of exceed our understanding of land and water as divided, vis-a-vis the European paintings, which are picaresque, where you see straight lines always make harbor. If you look at the folkloric paintings, which are not historical, they are produced in this moment, but it actually indexes an imagination that could be historical, could not be, but an imagination that has remained as a residual, where human habitation is happening in the water in those images rather than always on land. And it kind of muddies those spaces. And I try to think through those two. And what it helped me understand is, in the early documents early colonial documents, be it Benjamin Lacombe's work on where he's claiming this is where a harbor should be built, and his detractors saying this is actually not even land, you can't be building a harbor. And in the miasma, in the documents that produce Calcutta as a space of miasma, it is also a representational failure, where geographical sciences has not yet offered terms to understand what an alluvion is, what a wetland is, what an ecotone is. These terms are not available to the people who are actually grappling with these spaces in the 1820s, 1830s. So they are looking to commensurate through law and represent through law. So these kinds of spaces, and that's why we have something like Bengal alluvion, diluvian law in the 1820s, which interestingly is now called, a lot of these mobile landscape sedimentary deposits are called Bada Zameen, right? The BADA Zameen, that refers back to the legal naming of this thing. So I feel like the way representation work, and I had not thought of Anna Singh's economy of appearances to think through the material, but you're absolutely right. But I think representation works in three ways. One is the attempt at cartographic representation, which always fails. Then the representational failure, which results in these classic property disputes, because someone claims it's land, someone claims it's water, it lands up in a mayor's court. And how do you divide it? Does the territory department decide it, or does the river department decide it? And then you have this other kind where swarms are not miasmatic spaces in the municipal debate, but actually spaces of speculative futures where you can drain and develop. And that's how urbanism works in most Asian cities, from Jakarta through Mumbai, through Calcutta, through Madras. Like, you develop these swarms into making building. And a question I still have not been able to answer, but maybe one day I'll come up with the answer, is why are swampy cities speculative cities? Amsterdam, very expensive. Why is real estate expensive in like swampy cities? New York. And I don't know yet have the answer, but maybe one day I will have the answer to that.
That is a great question. And Kasia, we have 6 questions from our audience. And since we have about 20 minutes left, I'm wondering if it'd be okay to move to them.
Yes.
Debjani, I am blown away by the literature you had to master to write this book. It is such a web of different subfields and so on. But we have 2 questions about your archive. And I'm going to pin them together, if that's okay. The first is from Raj, who says, I haven't read the book yet, but since we are discussing your book, I want to ask, what are the sources you looked at in your study? Were they in English or Bengali or both? And I want to pin that to a question from Camellia Dewan. Thank you, Debjani, for writing such a rich, sophisticated, and important book. You show how the colonial regime sought to control and tame the canals and rivers, fixing them and drying them to make property stable. At the same time, you mentioned that you did not find any hard lines or colonial fixities within the archive. Could you elaborate more on this? Was there a shift from the company to the Raj in terms of such fixities and land-centric technologies?
Oh, thank you so much. That's those 2 are very excellent questions. So to the first look, so I looked at a range of sources. One of the things I tried to do was, because colonial urban historiography is overwhelmingly written from municipal archives, which I call the medico-municipal archive. I also call them the epidemiological archive. Although, given the fact that we are in a pandemic, I need to rethink my kind of pushing back on the epidemiological archive of urban historiography. But for me, the problem was, I felt like what these municipal archives produced were reports. And as scholars, we've turned to these reports to write our histories. And as anybody who's lived in India knows, or anywhere in South Asia know, that bureaucracies write reports and then life goes on. And Matthew Hull's book actually shows it wonderfully, like there's an entire world outside of reports. So I began initially by looking at the court records of property disputes. So a major chunk of my work comes out of these court records, which are the colonial archive. Another set comes out of engineering report, like wet dock construction and various kind of canal construction. So canal reports, wet dock reports, road construction reports. Then of course I use a lot of CIT, Calcutta Improvement Trust records. Apart from that, I looked at river surveys. So that's the colonial archive. And I did look at lots of stories, but there are 2 kinds of vernacular sources I use. I looked at language and words as archives. And I said language and words actually contain sedimentations of history in what we name things. And I looked at the word, like the 7 ways we say erosion in Bangla, to show that there is a sedimentation of history and livelihood in the river's relation with water, or water's relation with land, which cannot be captured in a simple word like erosion, because it just doesn't capture the range of way water works its way into land. I also looked at songs, especially Bhattacharya and Shari songs, which are songs about water. I looked at a range of doggerel verses that is collected in Ashankar Dere's book about, which is about basically fishermen's memories of Calcutta, where he tries to make a claim of fishermen as autochthonous people. And these are these songs are called shong, are performed to shong nritto. This is a particular kind of dance performance that happened all over Bengal, but he is someone who lives in Calcutta and remembers those. And what else? And I looked at a lot of paintings, like from Monosha Mongol, like the Paprocki and Monosha Mongol paintings, to also colonial paintings. And out of which I actually proposed maybe we need to move. And of course, I looked at maps, but I also proposed that maybe one way to approach urban space or spaces of this nature is moving away from cartography as an organizing principle of looking at urban landscape, because clearly it's very hard to say where Calcutta ends and where the peri-urban, the agrarian, all of that begins. I couldn't fix it. I found it very limiting to work with. That I proposed almanac forms of understanding. Almanac is a form of visuality in looking at spaces which actually takes seasonality, which takes tides, which takes mobility as central to a visual practice. And I try to bring that into my reading of the colonial archive. So Camelia, thank you for your question about the hard lines. So when I went into the archive, I thought like very much drawing upon subaltern studies and post-colonial studies, and this famous sentence that Ranojit Guha has about cadastre mapping is the blinkered vision of colonial visuality. I expected to find like there was a clear-cut method and a representational breakdown over and over again. But I actually saw 3 layers. So the engineers who were often working came out to be the most, engineers and cartographers often came out to be the most, some of the most sensitive readers, and these are colonial engineers I'm talking about, sensitive readers of the landscape, which of course became inaudible voices within the colonial bureaucracy. And that's why I said I often didn't find the hard lines. To give you an example, William Sage is a canal engineer in Bengal in 1856. So he's constantly write backs and says, the entire hydraulic engineering I'm being asked to do is based on riverine behavior built upon Po, Danube, and Thames. But Bengal rivers don't have a margin. And you want me to suppose a margin to build what you're asking me to build. And how do I build? Because I can't suppose a margin. And he said, we really need to move away from the word river, because this is not a nodi, which would be the Bangla term. He calls it nala, and a translation would be spill, channels, or drain. And he's saying this is a seasonal landscape. You cannot imagine margins. And so you had these voices. There was another person says, it's a bottomless alluvion. And you are asking me to build foundations exactly like you build foundations in temperate climates. But these were voices also of colonial engineers who were talking about frustration. And the final thing I'll tell you is James Rennell, who people who work on Bengal know him. He was the first person to do a topographic mapping of the Bengal Delta. And he was brought in as an expert witness in a court case in the late 18th century. And he says something, if I were to give the line to anybody without his name, they would say, oh, this must be Foucault. But he said, paper and property documents do not represent the reality on the ground about the landscape. So you cannot use these papers to decide a legal case. So for me, so when I talk about that, I see there are people within the bureaucracy of the British imperial bureaucracy who were talking about not just the challenges, but there is a different way of understanding this landscape. And maybe we need to pay attention to that. These are, of course, like voices that get drowned out. So I hope I've answered your questions.
I mean, I'm fascinated by all of this. I develop new questions as you're talking. I want to link 2 questions together. One is by Jania Mukherjee, who says, what a provocative discussion, so enriching. I think the historical lens not only enables us to go beyond the land, water, marsh metropolis, and also urban rural binaries, but also how ecological infrastructures were manipulated and utilized as ecosystem services by the state. Drubajyati Ghosh and others have argued that Calcutta is triple blessed or ecologically subsidized with the presence of the integrated canal wetland system. Do you think that the risk resilience boundary also gets blurred within the deltaic context of Calcutta? Apart from lamenting the fact that of why Calcutta was reclaimed on Delta, can we also optimize on this opportunity by reimagining and reconfiguring city nature equations during the contemporary times by paying heed to frameworks like sustainable flows? And I'd like to pin that to a second question that somebody asked at the bottom. Salini says, thank you for this enriching talk. I was thinking if you could throw some light on the idea of wetlands associated with feminized notions of uncertainty and fluidity.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Genia. I think one of the things I would like to say is one should read actually Genia's book on Calcutta and its blue infrastructure to really, which is an excellent book, which tries to use urban political ecology to think through some of these concepts, and also in some way Kasia's work on the idea of like where she develops a critique of these kinds of climate adaptation based out of either risk or resilience is kind of very important. And if I may take a detour through her work, because she shows that even these geographies of risk emerged out of actually practices of resilience and what I believe she calls anticipatory ruination, futures of anticipatory ruination. Did I get it right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And she looks at like within the Sundarban area, she actually looks at how shrimp or aquaculture developed as a response to climate adaptation produces new geographies of risk in some way. So to answer your question, Genia, you're absolutely right. Like there are other ways maybe Calcutta would push us to, or the ecological stories that might be sedimented and not the central focus might push us to rethink the relation between water, swamps, bogs, cities. At the same time, one of the things I will say is what at the moment is happening, precisely coming out of Professor Debjani Ghosh's concept idea that how the wetlands of Calcutta, and just for anyone who doesn't know, the wetlands of Calcutta are natural sewage treatment, which actually saves the city. And Calcutta doesn't have an enormous sewage system plant, which many cities with a population going anywhere between 8 to 14 million, depending on whether you're counting in the morning during the work hours or not work hours. So that sort of and so it does a natural sewage treatment through anaerobic and aerobic ponds that actually filters the water out, and it is maintained by, again, sometimes propertyless people, the fishermen, and the people who do pisciculture in these wetlands, and also agriculture. So Debjani Ghosh calls these ecological subsidies for the city because it saves the municipality enormous amount of money from being able to do enormous amount of money for not having to do sewage. He also points out that the rampant urbanization that's happening along the wetlands of Calcutta is actually dangerous, and he fought to make this a Ramsar site, a protected site. Not that it matters, we are building a highway and a bridge on the Ramsar site, so everything is possible if the builders' lobbies are strong. And so he is really pushing back against the urban, the rampant urbanization. On the other hand, what we've seen also in the recent last 4 or 5 years is governments, now that water has become such an important concept in the SDGs and the UN development, and we understand now water as ecologically important and has to be protected, there is a new kind of investment by the government in creating all these lakes, and like basically what the West Bengal government is doing is also building kind of like building cement structures around it to protect it, and that's creating a new form of dispossession. By even the protection of these ecologically sensitive wetlands is creating a new form of how do you say, new kinds of dispossession of the population who are living there, and the ones I'm calling the propertyless population. So definitely there is a way to get out of this risk resilience binary, which is very, very problematic, and understanding the city as a set of flows actually opens up new ways of understanding. By looking at the flowing water and the land, opens up new ways of understanding how we design, how we use law, how we build our property markets. The wetlands and the feminized notion, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I would be able to answer this question, Celine, because I'm trying to understand if it is feminized through flows, but maybe Kasia, you've done so much work on the shrimp aquaculture, and you've looked at the feminization also maybe of these spaces. Would you like to take that on? I think you would give a better answer than I can.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really challenging, but I think important question. I mean, I think that there are some, some broad points that are sort of embedded in the question itself about how these technologies of property that Debjani describes are fundamentally at odds with a kind of feminized vernacular ecology, right? I guess what I could contribute specifically, sort of empirically, to thinking about that is to think about how the way that these sort of technologies of property and the sort of intensive development of commercial forms of production throughout the Delta is at odds with ways of living in the Delta that are more conducive to sort of social reproduction within the Delta. So, so for example, I mean, Debjani mentioned my work on shrimp aquaculture, and one of the things that I've found in the Delta is that as sort of new forms of development have transitioned away from agricultural production, which is, indigenous to the way that people have lived and produced within this landscape for many, many generations, that these ways of producing have threatened, and sort of understanding property and how to inhabit property have threatened the ways that women contribute to production and social reproduction in the Delta. And so I think that, I mean, yeah, I'll have to think more with these sort of broader points about feminized understandings of fluidity. But I think that it's certainly true that there is, that Debjani's work is helping us to see sort of a longer history of how these new ways of understanding property and how it should be lived with and extracted from are a threat to the ways that women sort of inhabit and sort of shape the way that this landscape is managed and produced within.
Okay, we have a few more questions. I'm going to pin two more together because we only actually have a couple of minutes left. One is from Sam Grinsell that says, "Hi all, thanks for a fascinating discussion so far. I'm wondering how architecture sits within this landscape and these sets of technological fixing. Does it perhaps act as additional performance of fixing an embodied claim that the land beneath the new buildings must be solid?" It's a great question. How do water and earth also make the built environment as well as underpinning it? And then there's a question from Steve Lockett that says, "Last year I listened to an interesting presentation about schools on the Gangara River in Uttar Pradesh, where they are flooded every year and often the land is scoured away from beneath them, requiring the schools to be rebuilt. Given the seemingly stubborn rebuilding year on year, to what extent are the colonial attitudes and standards still in play in the present, insisting on claiming this floodplain land?"
Thank you so much. Yes. So Sam, that's an excellent question. Like if any of the builders of atmosphere found out I called it liquid land, which in Bangla would be Jola Jomi, and to sell someone Jola Jomi by claiming it Jomi is actually illegal. It would be, someone could bring a defamation case against me if they wanted. Thankfully they won't. No one reads academic books, definitely not once published by Cambridge University Press, definitely not the speculators. But it's interesting, like the question of the fact that this kind of the landscape, the liquid land or Jolajumi is within the legal terminology, is you have to actually declare if you're selling something like that or selling landscape that is being filled over. As far as I can talk about architecture, the architecture of Calcutta was very much replanted from an imagination, like that was like in some ways in what Anthony King writes about the building of bungalows, but he's looking at, of course, southern India, but it's very much built up from an imagination of what, with the Doric columns and all of that, it's built up upon the imagination of what proper capital of British Empire would look like. And I think the better work on the architecture that has been done on Calcutta is representing Calcutta by Shathi Chattopadhyay. She looks at architecture spaces, but more from a more as a site of disciplining population and how that's been built up. I am not sure there was much thinking about how to really meld, or I at least haven't done the research to understand how to meld the architecture with the with the specificity of the landscape that is kind of mobile and falls apart. The other work on architecture that looks at the courtyards of Calcutta and vernacular architecture that was very built like the houses of the wealthy Indians, which are built with courtyards and a different kind of housing setting. And Shadi Chattopadhyay also uses her work to show that there was never a black town and a white town. That's a classic division in colonial urban historiography, and shows spaces as much more mixed. The question, Steve, about the flooded and rebuilding, that's like a perennial question. Just for another paper I've been writing, it's by, on silt. There is this character called James Ferguson. He's a geologist and a potamologist. Some potamologists were 19th century people who worked on river. And his house was actually, his foundation was washed away when the river shifted. So he came up with this whole argument is trying to say a river is not a pendulum. Pendulum moves and comes back to the normal place, but the river moves and never comes back. And he develops this whole argument, but it is true. Like, so because these, there is a constant rebuilding effort, and this whole idea of build back better that we saw in New Orleans is also over there. Like, let's build back better. And especially with the recent cyclone, we saw like, we've again gone back to building more embankments, and schools often end up being one of the places, at least in the Sundarban, which often turns into shelters because they have concrete foundation. So one of the things is the question one has to ask is concrete always the best way to go about building in these spaces? We did not always have reinforced concrete till the early 20th century. And an alternative kind of imagination has to be developed that can make space for this kind of building and designing with the landscape. And that work is being done by landscape architects like Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dakuna, who've called these landscapes, their book Soak, and also their book Design in the Terrain of Water, actually tries to understand how people built and lived in this seasonal landscape, and how does one go forward. And like the fact that we think concrete, like what Sundarban has taught us, if anything, is concrete, the kind of certainty we build on the concrete construction has failed. And I think Meghna Mehta, who's been doing work there, has already shown how some of the concrete embankments, and I think Kasia was also telling me the concrete embankments that were built right after the last super cyclone Ayla, all collapsed in the cyclone Amphan. So that really has to be rethought. So you're absolutely right about what you are asking.
Oh, Debjani, that is such a great place to stop. And I'm just thinking everybody in Miami should read your book too. I want to thank our participants, Kasia Paprocki and Debjani Bhattacharyya. Yeah. And I am Claire Potter, the co-executive editor of Public Seminar and a professor of history at the New School. This has been a Public Seminar book talk. I want to invite everybody back on July 1st when we will be hosting Ariela Gross and Alejandro de la Fuente discussing their co-authored book, Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and the Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana. Kasia, Debjani, thank you so much for this lovely book talk. I have learned so much, and you have assembled a wonderful group of people to come and listen. Do come back.
Thank you so much, Claire, for organizing this. Thank you, Kasia, for taking the time to do this. This was amazing.
Yeah, okay, and thank you, audience, for wonderful questions. And do come back to Public Seminar anytime with your writing and with your books. Thank you so much.
Thank you.